All right, good day, everybody. Welcome to Beams and Columns. I am back. We're back in the new year, actually, with my co-host Shaun. Shaun, how are you doing? How are you starting off the new year?
I'm good, thanks. Happy New Year. Yeah, as I was saying to you, as we checked all the tech and everything, I'm kind of crawling around on floors with power tools again, as usual. Doesn't change. So,
That's good. You got your background up there, so we can't tell. You look
yeah,
good.
yeah. No, I'm hiding in the office at home, and as I was saying to Corey a moment ago, this is Malham Cove in the Yorkshire Dales in the UK. On a much nicer day than it is today over here, we've got horizontal rain and 50-mile-an-hour winds at the moment, so it's a bit messy and horrible out there.
Yeah, we're running the spectrum here. We've got you over in the UK with terrible winter weather. I'm here in Phoenix, Arizona, and I think we're going to hit 70 degrees today. So it's beautiful out. And then our guest is over in Florida with I suspect about the same weather as I have, although maybe you've got some rain. But we're excited to be back in the new year. Great to jump into January and start things off. Shaun, you and I have talked quite a bit about laser scanning and reality capture and virtual reality, and we've talked about some of the toys that we get, and I think you showed us on the last episode your new DJI drone. So I'm gonna start hitting you up on that to see if you've actually done anything with it.
I
Um,
have.
and nice. And I played around with trying to get my commercial drone pilot's license, because if in the U.S., if you do anything to make money with a drone, you're supposed to have that license, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
I'm not a videographer, and I'm not, I don't ever intend that to be my profession. But a couple of times I've put myself out of a job because I've walked up at something that they wanted me to. The last one was design scaffolding for this really strange looking building, really irregular roof, and they just needed to inspect, and they wanted me to design this really complicated scaffold system to inspect. And I looked at it and said, "That's crazy. Just get a drone up there." And like, "That's a good idea. We don't need you anymore. Call the." So I may start playing around with that just so I don't put myself out of business. But
Absolutely.
uh, you know, today we're going to talk to someone who's much more the expert, Shaun, than probably you and I are. And
Yeah.
I'm gonna let you introduce our guest
Yeah.
today.
So we've got Corey with us today, all the way from Florida, where hopefully the weather's a bit better than it is over here in the UK. And I'm a bit of a fan of Corey because I love stuff that is techie that you can potentially put in a frame and put on a wall. One of the reasons for that is the property that we bought last February is an old 1930s bungalow that's been converted. And when we got the deeds through, we got all the old original drawings, all the hand sketches and everything in the deeds.
Really,
And my
really.
plan is to get those all beautifully framed when we get around to it and have them all in the house. And some of the stuff, if you've looked at what Corey does on LinkedIn, he has this beautiful juxtaposition of the original image with the CAD image, either on top or over or around, sometimes in 2D, sometimes in 3D. And I thought that would make a really good beams and columns. So welcome, Corey, and glad
Thank
to have
you.
you here.
Glad to be
And
here.
yeah, no, it's really good. Obviously we've been talking before the broadcast to make sure that mics, videos, etc. are working. And one of the reasons I wanted to get you on board on the beams and columns today is, one, to rack your brains as to how you get these amazing images, but two, to kind of go through how you get that workflow from when the client brief comes in all the way to that wonderful artistic image at the end. And I mean, one of the questions that I want to ask you, and this goes back to a humorous level on that post that I posted of your stuff, where they kind of said, "Oh, he should have used Revit," and I'm like, "Yeah, that's great, but it wouldn't have done the same thing." So, from a software perspective,
hmm
obviously you use AutoCAD. That's one of the reasons why I follow you on LinkedIn and everything else.
hmm
But from a software perspective, when a client gives you a brief of something that they
hmm
need, What is your go-to piece of software, and how do you get those people kind of on board? Do you bring in experts in that software? Do you have contractors that create that kind of stuff, and so on? How does that work?
Everything starts with that initial brief, that initial phone call or text message or email from the client, and it's really very simple. You know, everyone always talks about the importance of listening, and that's what I do. And I listen to initially what the client is describing, and we get clients that, you know, could be a homeowner with zero experience in construction or architecture, design, whatever, or we can get a call from, you know, an architect that's been in the business for 30 years and has a whole Revit team and everything in between. And I really try to find out what they're trying. What is the project? Is it residential? Is it commercial? What is the scope of your, you know, deal? Is it a complete gut job? Are you saving the slab? Are you saving walls? Are you, you know, are you saving the roof? Is the roof going? Do you need roof structure? And what we try to do in the beginning, when we first I started doing this particular stuff about 6 years ago, the as-built scanning. And of course, I was blown away by the technology, and we're getting everything in 360 degrees and 3D and blah, blah, blah. And I found that you could easily spiral into some distraction of time wasting, you know, stuff that is literally just to impress yourself. And that doesn't do anything for the client. And the client's going to pay for all that time, or you might not even get the job. So what I try to do is pare down literally what the client needs for this particular job. And then it could be where they're like, you know, I've had some clients that are like, oh, we want it in 3D. And I'm like, well, what format? And they're like, well, we don't know. And I said, well, what we provide is pretty much either Revit, or we could do a 3D mesh file from the raw scans, but if you don't have an idea of a platform and you haven't hired your architect yet, we really recommend you not get 3D. Why don't we capture the scan now? And then you can decide on a deliverable after. So forgive me if I go off on a little tangent with all this, but it all starts with that, you know, initial question, and then we pare it down. And, you know, we just did a proposal for a client that wanted, you know, all electrical outlets and switches and all kinds of, you know, detail. And when they got the estimate, they're like, wait a minute, we don't need all that stuff. So I'm like, you just chopped our workflow or our workload in half and saved yourself. So anyway, that's as a long-winded answer. That's how we get to, you know, the scope.
Yeah, no, and I get that completely as well, and I think Jim probably gets that as well from a construction perspective as well, because there's so many ways that you can do things. And one of our previous guests last year is a very good friend of mine. He's an ex-Autodesk colleague. Is a guy called Pete Kelsey, and he's kind of gone on to do TV shows. He does the Skinwalker Ranch thing and all that kind of stuff, because he's basically a drone guy. And I've lost count of how many drones Pete actually owns now. It's scary. He's in double figures somewhere. But as he quite rightly said when we interviewed him on Beams and Columns, it's all about what the client wants rather than what you think they want. It's really important that you get that right, because like you say, you can go into true Alice in Wonderland and disappear down that rabbit hole and probably never come back again. And one of the things, as Jim and myself have talked about, I went wild and bought myself a drone just before Christmas. And I'm not a videographer either. I got my license just before Christmas as well, did the little exam online and everything else. But one of the things that I've realized with drones, my drone is nicknamed Eugene, by the way. He's called Eugene. If you've ever watched SpongeBob SquarePants, right? Eugene, Eugene Krabs, runs the little shop where you go and buy your little burgers and stuff, right? And basically, I've got a little landing gear for the drone. And when you stick this landing gear on the drone, he looks like a crab with little orange legs. So I just thought, it's got to be Eugene, right? So that's what he's called. But when I flew this drone for the first time, I was with my brother-in-law, and we literally launched it from the backyard of my place and flew it out over the fields, because I've got all farmers' fields on one side of me where I live. And the thing that blew me away was how this little tiny thing with these rotors on has so much intelligence built into it to allow you to gain as much information as possible. It's mind-blowing, because I can just hit a button and say, hey, come back. And it knows exactly where you are via GPS and just drops down, right in front of you and so on. and the sensors where, you know, it picks out hazards and stuff. And this is for people like Jim in construction as well. You know, if you've got a hazard in place, you can send the drone in instead of the human. The human is then driving the drone and is not in any way unsafe. And, you know, if a big concrete block lands on a drone, so be it. You know, it's a piece, it's an inanimate object. It's not a human underneath that concrete slab. So for me, that technology is amazing. And I can see how you're using that photogrammetry and also the, you know, the LiDAR and everything else to create information for your clients that 30 years ago would have been really difficult to get across. And like you say, you know, when you get that phone call, you've got to kind of listen, work out what information they need, because that, even my little drone, my little, you know, Mini Pro 3, I could fly that, say, around my little local church down the street. I'd have so much information, you know, and I could even drill down to a level where I can look at the mortar between the bricks if I wanted to, kind of idea, and do a condition survey, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
But it's paring down that information, like you said, with the switches and the power outlets and stuff. I mean, that's the sort of thing that, you know, if I was using Revit, the Revit model would just go poof. It would be huge if I put that information in there. So from that perspective, what sort of hardware are you using to gain this information? I'm assuming you're using, obviously, LiDAR, drones. I mean, you can even just use regular cameras, DSLRs, and so on. But what would be a typical setup for a typical project for you?
I'll tell you, we're on the Leica platform, Leica Geosystems, and we process everything through Cyclone, you know, Register 360. So we scan with the BLK 360, we scan with the RTC 360, and those two, we've messed around with the BLK to go, you know, the handheld SLAM system from Leica, which was awesome. Like, we scanned a giant shopping center in about 12 minutes walking around. So yeah, we don't own one of those, and we've been looking at SLAM systems, and we're debating whether or not it has enough, you know, use for us and our clients and what we're getting hired for. But I would have to say the workhorse of what we do is the BLK 360, and we have the older first generation, and we also have the new G2 that just came out a few months ago, and which is a great improvement, and it's faster, and, you know, the quality of the point cloud is excellent. But I find that for our clients, if the accuracy level is, if we can promise them a 1/4 inch, a 1/2 inch, they're thrilled. Which was actually a surprise when I first started doing this 6 years ago, because I'm saying to myself, yeah, because I'm thinking they want it within a millimeter, and they're going to have a door and window company. They're measuring openings. They're going to be ripping out framing. They don't need it down to a millimeter. They're thrilled with a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch, and the BLK 360 easily delivers that. So yeah. So you mentioned, you know, your drone, and is it the $30,000, you know, whatever, you know, drone? No, you could have a prosumer drone, and depending on how you use it, you can eke out the information you need to deliver a very impressive product.
Yeah. It's and throwing this at Jim now as well, from a construction perspective, things like condition surveys, you know, as-built surveys. I mean, we discussed this at length, didn't we, Jim, when they had the Boston Dynamics Spot the Dog at the Blogger Social at Autodesk University.
Right.
And we got talking about putting something like a LiDAR camera set up on top of Spot the Dog, and you just walk him around the building.
Sure.
Done. You know,
right.
You know.
Well, you know, and when you talk about like condition surveys, so I'll tell you one of my pet peeves, and one of the things that will set me off if I see it on a set of construction drawings is contractor responsible for verifying all dimensions.
Right.
That's not what you hired me to do. And I teach this in my classes all the time. If you're a contractor and you have a set of plans that says that, you better make sure that you're getting paid for that. And here's how the conversation is going to go, right? Well, hey, if you need me to go field verify all these dimensions, I need to get paid for that, and here's how much it's going to cost. And then they're going to say, hey, wait a minute, we already paid the owner. We already paid our architect for that. It's just the architect trying to get, trying to offload that risk to somebody else. But then when I bring it back to the workflow, what's interesting, and I'll pick on Starbucks again. This is my month for picking on Starbucks, I guess. So at one point I was sitting in Starbucks and there were these two guys, and they're running around the store measuring things, and every once in a while they've got to ask somebody to move, and they're measuring windows and openings and distances. And so I finally asked, what's up? And there were two architects who had flown to Arizona from California with their tape measure. And now they're measuring as much as they can, right? And from this, they're going to produce a set of drawings to renovate the interior of this Starbucks. Now, they can only measure so much, right? I mean, we all do this at home, right? You measure as much as you think you're supposed to, and then you're working on something and you go, oh, I didn't measure that. So these days, and this was recent, by the way, this was within the last year. And to me, that's just no longer the way to do things. I mean, am I missing something, Corey? I mean, it should have been, oh, I'm going to call Corey. We're just going to scan the interior of this, and then I'm done. Am I missing anything there?
No, you're nailing it, because I think what you just described is the CYA that is left over from, I guess, hundreds of years of the construction world. And another thing that surprised me when I got into this a few years ago was the amount of CYA from everybody, which no one takes responsibility for anything, which means a project could get measured 8 times from 8 different subcontractors, and the architect who might have taken the plans from the city and incorporated some stuff into the CADs, and then just put it out there with the big, disclaimer. And then everyone has to kind of fend for themselves, which they all charge for that time. So it increases cost. And I part of what I try to explain is that, no, let us go in once. You get one set of truth. You then distribute that truth so that, okay, the window people probably have to come in, if they're doing, let's say, pockets above a window for window coverings, they probably do have to come in with the millimeters or whatever, since we're going to be plus or minus a quarter inch. But 90% of all the other stuff and estimating, they don't need to come in at the estimating. They don't need to show up on site, because we provide 360 photos. While we're scanning, we host some of that data online. So even the Starbucks people probably didn't have. They probably have a photo roll on their cell phones from 18 different locations from their travels. So we'd rather just see 80 360 images from every possible point in the project.
No, I totally get it. And one of the things that I'm kind of working towards slowly, apart from the fact that we've had 6 power cuts in the last 24 hours where I live, which is just weird. They're like little 30-second ones, so you then have to reset every damn clock in the house, that kind of thing.
Sure.
But I'm slowly moving up to the cloud with everything, all the work that I do, because I'm done with walking into my, you have things like Best Buy and stuff like that. We have a thing called PC World here. And you walk in and you look at the laptops and you think, how big's the hard drive? Because I know that all the files that I'm working with, like my DWGs, my RVTs, my point clouds, everything else, they're going to be big. And you think to yourself, do I need a portable hard drive to plug into the USB, or do I have a server at home? And I just thought to myself, why don't I just rent some space in the cloud? OneDrive does it, Google Drive does it. They all do it. And one of the things I'm finding now is, having made that transition, it's so much easier to collaborate with everybody. So if I was working with Jim and I said, oh, here's my DWG as built, I can just go share, done. He's got the file. But more importantly, as well, one of the lovely things with AutoCAD now is you've got your DWG file history as well. So if Jim works on that same file and it's got the same name and he saves it, he can either use something like Trace in AutoCAD now, or even if he's just saved a newer version of the file, when I open up my version of the file, it'll go, oh, there's a newer version available. So I jump into Jim's version and I see what changes he's made. And that technology, that collaborative landscape now is incredible for people
Mhm.
like myself who are creating
Mhm.
the drawings, because
Mhm.
I'd sort of come to someone like Corey and go, hey, I need this. My client needs this. Can you liaise with the client? Get everything I need so that I can drop that point cloud either into AutoCAD or into Revit or whatever. And then I
Mhm.
create all the documents that are needed to pass them on to Jim, but also Jim can also access anything else he might need, like the point cloud and so on, as a contractor as well. And
Mhm.
something that got discussed at Autodesk University last year was we had a panel where we were, and it was a fantastic slide. It was literally dropped in at the last minute into the panel. But basically, it kind of started with the general contractor being Clint Eastwood, and it ended up with the owner of the building being Squidward from SpongeBob SquarePants. So you can imagine the transition, right? You go sort of Clint Eastwood, Lee Van
Mhm.
Cleef, and so on, all the way down
Mhm.
through a few Disney characters and things like that, and you end up with this really sad-looking, Squidward
Sure.
at the end,
Sure.
going,
Very
"What do I do with
ornery.
all this stuff?" It's like,
Right. Right.
but yeah, so
Yep.
all of this information, like you quite rightly say, and as Jim quite rightly says, it can be reiterated over and over again when it doesn't need to be. And that's another
Right.
reason why I kind of got you in today as well, is you've summed it up. You do that one truth,
Mhm.
and that's where it needs to come from. And I think Jim will totally relate to that as well. So
Well, yeah, if you give me that one truth, and I'm the general contractor, I've got almost everything I need.
Mhm.
If I'm missing something, I can probably find it somewhere in your documentation, whether that's the scan or the 3D imagery.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
and then, like you said, if you happen to be a trade that needs finer detail, you're always going to go out and measure that anyway before
Mhm.
you say fabricate something.
Mhm.
But I don't want to have to go out and measure everything. I should not have to field verify
Mm-mm.
the square footage to order flooring,
No.
right? If
Nope.
you do a scan, you're within plus or minus quarter inch. I guarantee you, I'm within my tolerance on what I need to order for flooring. So it's
Right.
uh, yeah, it's the way to go. Corey, I've got a question here, kind of staying in the weeds a little bit, that I want
Mhm.
to throw out just for clarification. Of course, it's going to cut you off, so I'm going to move us around. Um,
Right.
so you mentioned to first get the scan before handing over the 3D to the client. Isn't the scan already a 3D file? So this goes to your comment when we first started about, do you need 2D or 3D?
Mhm.
Maybe just kind of
Sure.
clarify that workflow a little bit.
Absolutely. I always talk about starting with the end. So in that initial phone call, um, we're finding out what their platform is, what's your workflow internally. So someone will say, "Well, we're a Revit workflow." Okay, great. What version of Revit? Okay, 2022. Great. Now we know what we're delivering. Then we have a series of questions on the details within the Revit and whether you need the electrical lighting, blah blah blah. Site plan. No. If someone says to me, in fact, I have one of our earliest clients, which actually was a little deceiving for us. One of our earliest clients in this business knew what to do with a point cloud. And he was an architect and not old, not young, just, and he's like, no, just send over the point cloud. And I'm like, are you sure? He goes, yeah, just make it a recap project. Great. So we exported it for him and he was thrilled. And he only paid us literally to go on site and scan, no modeling, no drafting. And he got it in, I think we did it in 24 hours. We just, cleaned it up a bit, registered everything, and he downloaded it from our Google Drive. So to answer the question, we don't decide anything as far as format or deliverables. The client decides based on their workflow. We know it up front, and then we just execute and deliver whatever that is. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, the point being, you don't want to deliver the client a format that they can't work with. I mean, give the client the
Right.
format that they can work with. So,
Right. And the telltale sign is when they say, well, can you just email the point cloud? And I'm like, okay, we're not even going to talk about point clouds anymore.
Yeah.
No, we're happy to give guidance as well. And if someone wants to try sometimes a client will say, well, we really want to move into this 3D modeling, or we want to get from out AutoCAD to Revit. Can you just send the point cloud and we'll have our people, we have some younger people that want to figure this stuff out. I'm all for it, and I support that.
Yeah.
The only caveat I tell them is, don't call us in a panic and you want a Revit file in 2 days because it's late. Just know that, we'll have to, schedule it in our workflow. But a lot of clients surprisingly pushed themselves and learned how to model from a point cloud.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I'm totally with you on that as well. I'm one of those people that would say, send me the point cloud, purely because I'm then slightly out of my comfort zone, and I'm like, right, I've got to learn how to do this. So, I mean, I know what a point cloud is, and Recap is my particular, photogrammetry kind of processing tool of choice. But you can just, I mean, the crazy thing is now, I mean, Autodesk have done really well with this, and so have a few other software vendors as well. But the lovely thing is now is you can just say to AutoCAD, here's the point cloud. That's it. As long as you've got that raw point cloud file, whatever format it is, whatever file name it has, you can drop it in to either Revit, AutoCAD, or various other products as well. And I always remember when Autodesk first kind of started kind of pushing towards the customer, saying, this is what you can do. And I can always remember it was the old DJI Mavic, the first one that came out with the little like table legs as kind of support.
That's what we have.
Yeah. And they're brilliant. They're absolute workhorses, and there's I don't know if it's still on the Autodesk website, but it's one of the old gun emplacements out near San Francisco that they have along the coast. And they basically show this guy, he's got a little dog, just to make it all very human and everything. And he trundles up with his drone, does all the photography, and then they kind of show this infomercial kind of process where it's like, oh, here's all the photographs. They go into Recap and they go into Revit. And then this guy designs this sort of Tony Stark, Marvel type house in this gun emplacement, looking out, to sea and everything else. And when I saw that, the workflow for me, it was like, this covers so many bases that I used to have to cover manually. I used to have to go and measure everything. Like Jim said, you get that little one-liner in the notes column saying, you such and such is responsible for all the dimensions on this drawing. And I'm like, I don't have to think about that anymore, because like Corey just said, you've got the truth. It's right there. There's that point cloud. And the technology now is coming to such a point where it's not just the LiDAR and the photogrammetry. You can take this stuff, and I hate this phrase, just so you know. You can take this stuff into the metaverse now, as they call it, or as 20 odd years ago, we just called it virtual reality, right? But Mark Zuckerberg seems to want to call it the metaverse. Anyway, long story there. I won't bore you with that one. But I actually was at Autodesk University a few years back, and one of the things they were working on with the French government was the Eiffel Tower and all that area there, where they're refurbishing it all and urbanizing it and everything else. And they had a VR headset that you could pop on with the paddles, and you could walk around all from point clouds and everything else. You could wander up the Eiffel Tower, go from sunrise to sunset and check the traffic count and everything else. And I just thought to myself, this is insanely clever. And I think what we've got to realize, just to kind of encompass it all, is we're not just looking at a drawing anymore. We're not just looking at an as-built blueprint, Jim, for example, that you might look at, for example, on the construction side of things and everything else. What we're looking at now is an object, a real life object, but in many different ways. And that's why I see some of your stuff as artwork. And that goes back to that conversation I had with that person on LinkedIn saying, read the post. Because I wasn't talking about, it should be a Revit file, it should be an AutoCAD file. What I was saying was that Corey had created this beautiful image of two different views of the same object using two different points of information that give you a visual that you could hang on a wall easily, no problem at all. And for me, there you go. That's one of them right there. And
That's it. What was that? Wasn't that it? That was the
I
one
think
that you
that might have
posted?
been the one where they commented on the Revit and said, "Oh, why didn't you use
Yeah.
Revit?" And it's got nothing to do with Revit. If you look at that image, I'd be happy if I was your client. I'd be happy to have that image in a frame on my wall because it
Well,
it explains everything.
I'll tell you. I'll tell you about that particular project, and it was such a tiny thing. It's literally an old kitchen in a historic home, and the client was a decorator, or I'm sorry, interior designer that needed the dimensions of the existing walls so that she could do new cabinetry, new windows, new doors, probably a new refrigerator, oven, stove, whatever. I literally scanned it in about 3 minutes. It and then she needed 2D AutoCAD. We did that in Revit actually, and exported the 2D DWG files. And it was all done in like 48 hours. And it was a tiny job. So when I was making that image, I mean, what we deliver to the client and what we use for social media are two different objectives. So once the deliverables are already done, I just take a look at what I've got here and say, how could I tell this story in a visually interesting way? Because if I just uploaded, a DWG, everyone's going to look at it. I might get some people interested, but you have to have a little bit more to show people in social media. So I figured, why not start with kind of the raw materials, and then on top of it, that's what I love to show, the juxtaposition between here's kind of the ingredients, and then here's the finished plate. And isn't that so appetizing and beautiful? And explain the utility of each. And here I've just given away my marketing strategy. But because sometimes people look on my screen and they'll be like, "Oh, you should post that," and I'm like, "No." I'm like, all that is a 3D point cloud. It doesn't say anything to an architect. Like, how does an architect use this? What is it? Where's the connection with their existing work? You have an architect that's been working in AutoCAD for 20 years, and if he sees that, he's going to get excited. Meanwhile, if I just show a floor plan, he's like, okay, whatever. So yeah, same with that. That was actually a capture from the C2A platform, and we use C2A to display 3D point cloud data along with 360 photos. And I think I played with the opacity of a Revit file with the point cloud, and then exported that. And then I would get, emails from engineers saying, we have a facility, can you do that for us? And, we're doing things the old fashioned way. How could we incorporate this? We're flying people out to the facility to look at stuff. Can you just give us that in a web browser? Like, that's all we do. So
yeah.
How much and I'm asking this because I've totally lost track. So I did a LinkedIn learning course that's still up called like Technology on the Job Site, and I did it 6 years ago, and so it's funny to go back and watch and realize how different we are 6 years ago, to now. So that particular job was, I think it was a Sun DPR joint venture. It was a hospital tower, new hospital tower that they were constructing, and DPR had created all of this software and workflow to allow them to go in. That what they would do is they would set the structural steel, they would set the metal deck, and then prior to placing concrete on the metal deck, they would go ahead and laser scan, and from the laser scan, they were getting deflection on the beams, the steel beams above. They were getting kind of as-built for everything that was going to be in the concrete slab before they placed concrete, along with a few other things. And then they did that also at various points throughout construction to get as-built of everything that's in the wall, in these surgical suites that are very have a million tubes and wires and switches in the wall. But at that point, the workflow was very proprietary. And there was some real skill and effort and knowledge that went into moving from that point cloud that was the scan that was fairly easy to capture to getting it into Revit to be able to compare it with as designed. So we get as built versus as designed. And I believe that the amount of effort has gone way down now. But can you give us an idea, just, like what is, for something like that, what is the amount of post processing, that's involved? Or if I go into, use my Starbucks example, I go into Starbucks, it's just a coffee shop. It's fairly simple. I do my scan. How much post processing time or effort is involved in getting that into? I'll just use Revit because that's, everybody wants that perfect 3D model where I can measure it.
So like a typical Starbucks location might be what, 2,500 square feet,
Sure.
with front and back, and, whatever, the hallway and employee bathrooms and a small office, whatever. If a commercial, retail as built, 99.9% of the time they want everything documented. So data ports, light switches, AC, vents, ducts, equipment, everything. So scanning in there, might take an hour or two. And then Revit modeling after the scans are cleaned up depends on which of our modelers would get that job. Some are faster than others. Some have certain specialties, but roughly a week to week and a half. I would quote a week to week and a half. Maybe we would deliver it sooner, but that's a rough estimate. And that's keeping within a certain accuracy. Maybe we're staying within a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch on that. If it's less accuracy, obviously that'd model a lot faster.
Okay. So that level, even after that was interesting because I would not have guessed that. So even after you get the scans, the level of accuracy that I would want as a client is still going to affect your modeling time.
Yes, and I am not a modeler, and I don't even know Revit. I could get around Revit a little bit, but I choose to leave that to our experts. And yeah, if they're adhering to a tighter accuracy, they're zooming in more, they're seeing where that line is, and maybe there's some distortion in the point cloud, or maybe there's something that's just not aligning. And then, it might be a wall. Like, we'll scan, stuff that was built in Miami Beach in the 1920s. And I don't know what, those guys were drinking at the time, but sometimes we'll have a wall and they're like, it's a historic building. And I'm like, you know what? I've seen slopes from history. I haven't seen like a wall just kind of go back and forth,
You haven't been to my house yet, Corey, have you?
Oh yeah. England is a whole other level. So again, the beer is, very strong.
Some of our original walls go like this. Seriously.
Yeah.
They have bows in them and they're like that or like that.
Sure.
This is the 1930s. I mean, the funniest thing, I mentioned the deeds about the property, and this kind of leads into my next question as well. Obviously, there's a degree of accuracy that you're going to work to, like, 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 an inch, whatever. But one of the things that I find, especially with this house in particular, is that you're kind of measuring stuff. And the problem you've got, I mean, my kitchen's half refurb now, but you get these lovely kitchen carcasses and everything, and then you suddenly realize that your wall is like this next to the carcass. And you've got to figure out ways around that and hiding the gap and all that kind of stuff. And when you make that transition from that point cloud with that original weird and wonderful, let's say Miami 1920s, 1930s kind of information, what are your guys doing to, I want to say, rectify that, but obviously they might not want to. They might want to keep all the original idiosyncrasies of that particular building for historical purposes, for example. But if you had a building like that, what do your guys do for the client? Do you tidy that up? Do you tweak that to allow for things to happen more easily within the model?
I will tell you, first, I let the client make that decision up front, and that's in the estimating process. Because I've had jobs where the client's like, please make all the angles 90 degrees. Okay, well, what if we have one that's way off? If it's off more than X, then model as is, which in Revit is going to be a kind of a custom model in place object versus a standard wall object. And so that's the answer to the question. We don't struggle. Like once the thing is done, it's like a train and it's traveling down the tracks and it's going according to the original, agreement with the
Sure.
client. So upfront, and we've had both. We've had clients who are like, we need every deviation. I did a historic project in Miami Beach, a 1925 house, and the client was an engineer, and he needed evidence to present to the historic board because it was a high-profile historic project. He needed evidence that the floor needed to be ripped out, the original floor. And so he wanted all of these weird distortions, and this one was probably due to moisture, over time.
Sure.
So we showed these slopes and these buckles, and he wanted everything shown. So that's what we gave him.
Okay.
And he used it and they approved his, they made him put in a new floor that literally was exactly like the old floor, but at least he got the approval to rip it out.
Well, yeah, that's right. And sometimes things like that, as much as I love historic buildings, I mean, I love the place I'm in. It drives me insane sometimes when I put a lovely carcass in and I realize I've got a 2-inch gap at the top and a 1-inch gap at the bottom. But, that's fixable. It's my home. I can do whatever I want with that. Now, that kind of leads on to another kind of question from me, where you've got these idiosyncrasies, and obviously that the client makes that decision, like you've quite rightly specified, in the last question. What about documenting obviously you've got the point cloud, but you've also got a lot of these other little sort of like, I'm thinking Polycam, I'm thinking Canvas, all these little apps now where you can use LiDAR on the mobile device. And I mean, one of the ones that Jim and myself have been talking about is Polycam, and there's also another one called Canvas that I use a lot.
Sure.
I've actually included that in some of my LinkedIn learning courses as well. Do you guys use that for like what I call the minutiae of a product, the little intricate details, and then export that out at all? Or do you just do an all-encompassing kind of view?
We've messed around with those apps, and Polycam is very impressive. However, if we're scanning a simple room, you could get something slightly usable visually out of Polycam. I don't see it getting anywhere near the level of cleanliness or documentation that we would ever provide to a client. And I imagine those mobile apps kind of encroaching on our, let's say, more simpler projects, like if that kitchen that we saw didn't require good measurements and the designer just wanted a schematic, documentation, Polycam could certainly do it. And I think in a few years, they won't even think twice about calling me for something like that. But the fact she needed measurements, it's like, it has to be LiDAR. It has to be done by someone who knows. But to answer your question about what we deliver as far as kind of like a master ground level documentation that can be just preserving whatever this is, I usually give a thumb drive to a client and say, here's a point cloud. It's, 20 gigabytes. You probably don't know what to do with it. You probably don't have the format, but here, put this in a safe somewhere and label it, because if in the future, you always have what you did before you demoed. So I give them something that's a great documentation that they can't use for any purpose other than, who knows, some legal thing that comes up, and then at least they have something.
Exactly. And Jim was summing it up about his course that is now 6 years old with the technology in the workplace, right? And how we've moved along. It's like anything. I mean, I could go on about this at length, but I'm not going to. But I'm a bit of a musician, and I've dabbled, and I've recorded an album and everything else. And one piece of information I was always given by everybody who recorded my music was, here's the master, burn it to a CD, put it in a jiffy bag in the post, and send it to yourself.
Very good.
Because then it's yours. You own the copyright. Never, ever open that one that you've mailed to yourself either. Leave it in a drawer somewhere. And like you quite rightly say, the client then has that raw piece of information that legally is theirs. And more importantly, you can then refer back to that, regardless of whatever iterations have been used in, during that project. And
Correct.
yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that one. I don't know if you've heard of Ove Arup and Partners, or Arups. They're an engineering company in the UK.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I worked for them many years ago. I've also done a bit of work for Farrell's Architects. I worked for them for a little while as well. And each of those individual organizations had a safe where they literally locked away all the originals, and that's it. No one was ever allowed in that safe after the project was finished. It was like they stay in there, they do not come out. And it's so important. And I think what we've got now in the technological landscape now is we've got an ability, and this goes into things like digital twins and all that kind of stuff as well. We've got the ability now to record everything as it is. And then when we make the changes, we've got an original and we've got a revised. And for me, call me a purist if you want to, that's the perfect environment for me, because nobody can argue that truth that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I think there's a position that I don't know if it exists, and it probably does in some firms, but kind of a digital librarian. And if you ever said to a CEO or CFO, oh, we need to hire a digital librarian, and they probably get paid $100,000 a year, and they'll be like, we don't need one. Let so and so just think about it. No. I believe, for the reason you just said, every company that has a significant, amount of work, volume of work, needs someone just to manage what you just described. What's the workflow? What's the naming convention? Where is it stored? How is it stored? What are the formats? Is it one format or is it 4 formats? What's our digital preservation strategy going forward? Because actually Adobe, and I'm from the photography world and the marketing material production side of things. And Adobe always they called it the digital dark age. And as photography was moving from film, which you could probably see I'm old enough to remember that transition in around 2003, Adobe said, you need to store a DNG, which was a digital negative raw file. You need to store a TIFF. You need to store a high-res JPEG. And what you did was kind of hedge your bets on the formats and archive it, keep it on a drive, duplicate the drive, take the duplicate drive, that would have USB and all these, you know what I mean? What you're doing is you're kind of increasing your variables for 15 years down the road. We need to go back to that because film, the funny thing is that film, if we had a negative today, okay, a film negative shot 130 years ago, we can just now probably take that and scan it in somewhere. And that says a lot for film as a format. In 120 years, are they going to know what to do with a JPEG? Are they going to know? So that's, anyway, to get back to your point of storage, and archival, it really requires a strategic thinking librarian at any firm that plans to have anything to use, in a few years.
Yeah, and also, I mean, from a legal standpoint as well, let's say, I mean, one of the things that I always remember, and this is a really weird analogy, by the way, I used to go over to Autodesk in San Francisco a lot, and they've got a big building, One Market on Embarcadero, and basically, I can always remember watching Dirty Harry and the Deadpool when they had the elevated highway going along. Along the seafront where the Port Authority building was.
The Nimitz Freeway?
Yeah. And that's not there anymore because of the earthquake.
Correct.
And you kind of think to yourself, well, are there still, more to the point, is there still original documentation to show what that was like historically, but also more importantly, legally? Because when there's a disaster like that, I don't want to say that there's always somebody at fault, because sometimes it can be a tragic accident. That's just the way it is. And nature has a way, especially with climate change now, of saying, who's the boss, so to speak. But when something like that happens, you get that elevated highway collapsing in an earthquake. And unfortunately, we live in a society where litigation is often raised around things like that. Do we have the original documentation, the original drawings, anything that we can refer back to. And I think, with Jim as well, especially in construction, this is so important because no matter what you do now, that there has to be a legal ramification as well as an engineering ramification, a design ramification, and so on.
Yeah, well, and that's Corey's. I love your example of the hard drive with just the point cloud, right? Like you can't do anything with it, but this is all the raw data. You sort of combine that with your discussion of film, and yes, I'll go back to my early days of construction. I lived in California. I ran a general engineering construction company. We did a lot of really complex street improvement projects, and we did them in places like Newport Beach and Corona del Mar, where like disturbing the houses that fronted the street was a really, really big deal. And so, in the early days, I'd walk along before we even mobilized. I'd walk along with the Polaroid, snapping pictures at a dollar, a shot, so I could, I got what I wanted, and just to document. We never did anything with them unless somebody got angry, but they just just to document. And then we moved to video. Okay, now this is much easier. I can walk down the street with my video camera and get this horrible, terrible, bumpy. But it at least shows, no, it wasn't gold plated before. It was, just whatever. But we were always obviously missing dimensions. And so every once in a while we would throw up, a tape measure or something, and then take a picture if we were concerned about dimensions. But that's and I'm just wondering if anybody ever does this. Now I look at the work I used to do and I go, oh, well, now what I would do is I would probably just call you and have you just scan everything. I don't need you to process it. I don't need you to do it. Just scan it and hand it to me. And unless we get in trouble later, or we need, maybe it's not trouble. Maybe we damage something and we need to know how to put back exactly what was there. And we're not, and we've got it all now. I can still call you and say, hey, I'm going to send you back this point cloud, or I need you to pull up this point cloud and process this section because I need to rebuild it.
You got it.
Yeah. And that's the magic of what we've got now. I mean, going back to your Polaroid era, Jim, I can remember that. And then I suddenly remember, moving to, when the iPhone came out, oh, wow, I can take a picture with my phone. Literally, you could go click, 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 and you've got that information there. And Autodesk jumped on that technology quite a while back, where you could add comments to a drawing in the Autodesk viewer, for example, and you could have comments like we got, the comments kicking off on where we are now with the podcast today. And those comments can then be linked to a JPEG that somebody's uploaded from their phone, and you could go, oh, this particular detail in the drawing refers to this particular photograph, and all those comments could be saved or exported out or whatever. But now we're at a point, especially with things like the Leica stuff and everything, it's just so accurate that almost photography is almost becoming redundant now with regard to any project we work on, because the point cloud is just so much more accurate. And I can still remember holding up my iPhone, and I'd have somebody standing with a leveling staff against a wall, and I'd just go click, so that I knew that I could measure that door or measure that window using that leveling staff measurement, and just stick it into AutoCAD as a backdrop, as a graphic, and draw over it. And that I don't need to do that anymore. I honestly don't need to do that anymore. And that for me, that kind of iPhone photograph with the leveling staff is where I saw the artistry and what you put out there on social media now. I thought, I used to do that kind of stuff, but for a reason. But now Corey's putting it up there, and he's making it like, yeah, I might have to contact Corey and get that image and put it up on my wall, because it it gives you that beautiful visual of a holistic view of a project. And the kitchen one is great. I love that kitchen one because it's so simplistic, but it just encapsulates exactly where we are now, because I've got that 3D model of it, but I've got that beautiful little 2D plan with all the dimensions on it, which they need to measure up on site, for example. It's clever stuff. And, Jim and me talk about this constantly, don't we? Measurement and everything else, and getting it right on site. And it's it's getting to a point now where obviously we've got to have that overview. We've got to have that kind of checks and balances to make sure it is right. Obviously, you know, that I would never ever willingly say, here's a point cloud without making sure that it's accurate.
Mhm.
But you're now at a point, and I don't know whether the AI that's all kicking off now, you know, you've got all that kind of stuff kicking in, and that happened sort of just over New Year. Everybody was talking about Chat GPT and all that kind of stuff. But
Mhm.
but the AI could potentially be checking for us. And sorry, I'm of an era where I would still not trust AI to check anything fully,
Mhm.
but some
Mhm.
people might.
Right.
But what I'm seeing is just this. The only way to describe it is a holistic environment that we work in now. Whereas back in the day, you had your drawings on the board, you had Jim on site receiving those drawings on the Monday and snagging and then sending them back on the Friday so that I could redo the drawings for the following. You know, that cycle used to happen, but now it's real time. You've got the cloud storage, you've got the point cloud in there, you've got the Revit model in there, and I think what you're doing, Corey, is just such a clever thing. And I would like to see a lot more people do what you do, because for me, if you approach me and said, you know, okay, we've got this, is that what you need? I could have that conversation with you and say, well, maybe I just need that. And
Mhm.
one, it halves the time for workload for you, but
Mhm.
secondly, it allows the project to happen quicker from a productivity basis as well.
Mhm.
And I'm just going to put hands up and just say, yeah, I love the world I'm in, and I love the way the tech's going. Basically, I really do.
Sure.
And you know, that's why I got you on here today and spoke to Jim about it. You know, because it's fun. I'm a bit of a geek, and it's just fun stuff, and I love it. Basically. So.
Well,
Oh.
and Shaun, we're down to we got a few minutes left to go. So I'm going to ask Corey. You know, where do you see things? I really see this industry, and I don't even know what this industry is: reality capture, you know, digital twins, virtual design and construction, whatever. I really see it as being in its infancy, but maybe I'm wrong. But I'm curious to know. Maybe leave us with, you know, where do you think we are, and you know, where do you see us being in 5 years? Like how much uptake or advance do you think we're going to be in 5 years?
As purely opinion, and I'm not
Sure.
a fortune teller. However, what I feel, I see the world of right now. We've got, you know, construction and its trajectory, and then we have photography and lidar and the visual stuff trajectory, and then we have this whole new category of VR, AR, AI. I see all of them merging the way that your phone, but we just call it our phone. But the truth is, it's an appliance that is combining. I don't know how many appliances did our phone combine just a few years ago. You know, a computer, a phone, a camera, a video camera. If you know, so I see the worlds that we're just discussing all converging, all helping each other. The computer that I'm talking to you on right now, it's an MSI, it's a gaming computer. And why did I get it? It's because I can process massive amounts of data on it. So the gaming world actually helped the architecture and construction world. And I just see all these converging together. The apps that we were talking about, I see as taking away, kind of like how desktop publishing in the 80s, it didn't take away all the graphic designers, but what it did was the company flyers and, you know, the lost dog, you know, post that you had to do down at the corner, you know, those quick, simple projects that were never great anyway, you know, would just go, you could just solve those problems immediately. But if you needed to design an annual report, you still needed to have a graphic designer. So anyway, I see the big jobs staying because they'll need to be expertise, you know, done by experts. But all of the smaller random jobs, you know, going to these little apps and consumers kind of just taking care of themselves.
That's great. That's great. I love it. Yeah, it'll be and like you said, it's hard to tell the future, and then you throw in Shaun's AI that I know you're not happy about, Shaun, but everybody's
Yeah,
talking
it's going
about.
to be
It'll be
interesting.
interesting to see
It's
how all that
going to be
clashes
interesting.
and combines. So, um, Corey, we really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you very much for talking to us and giving us your wisdom and insights. Shaun and I will be back next month. I don't know that we have our guest locked in for next month yet, do we, Shaun?
No, not yet. I've got a list, but it's getting people on that list to come back and say, yeah, they're free. It's the same old story, herding cats and diaries.
Yeah, no problem. Well, yeah, but anyway, Corey, thank you again for joining us. I've thrown your LinkedIn URL up on the screen a couple of times. Corey's the guy to follow if you're interested in this kind of stuff. We always appreciate everybody that tunes in and watches us. You can follow Shaun and I on LinkedIn as well, and we will be back next month with another guest, and you'll see an announcement on that very soon.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you very much.
And thank you, Corey. Yeah, much appreciated. Really appreciate your input today. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
No problem. Bye-bye.
Cheers now.